Hey everybody, thanks for joining me here for this video. In this video, we're going to be reviewing motivation concepts as covered in Chapter 7 of Organizational Behavior by Robbins and Judge. Now, we're going to start by talking about motivation. And typically, when we think about motivation, we tend to think about how hard people try, how inspired they might be to do something. And as we talk about motivation in this unit, we're going to talk about the process that accounts for intensity, direction, and persistence of effort. And what's really interesting about motivation is that it can not only vary by individual, but can also vary within individuals at times. So it's sometimes you may feel very motivated, whereas at others you don't. All right, let's get into this and break this down. The first component of motivation we're going to talk about here is intensity. Okay, and intensity is concerned with how hard a person tries. You'll notice the quote I put on this slide is from Steve Prefontaine, a great American distance runner, who said, "To give anything less than your best is to sacrifice the gift." And Pre was known for always trying as hard as he could at all times, even when his coaches told him not to. Okay, so that's an example of high intensity. Other people may pace themselves differently. They may not give everything they can at one moment. And that might be a lower level of intensity or maybe a moderate level of intensity. The next component to motivation we're going to talk about is direction. And this is working in the orientation that benefits your organization or you as an individual. Okay, and here I've got another sports quote. This one is from Michael Jordan. He said, "You can practice shooting 8 hours a day, but if your technique is wrong, then all you become is very good at shooting the wrong way." And this one really resonates with me because when I was a kid, my parents set my basketball hoop at 9.5 feet tall, and I would always practice shooting baskets at 9.5 feet. And at 9.5 feet tall, I was great. As soon as I went down to the park and got on a regular 10-foot rim, it was a disaster, absolute disaster. Once that happened, okay. But we see this as a practical issue in school. We see this as a practical issue in organizations. So, for example, in school, oftentimes students will study really hard for an exam and then maybe not do as well in the exam as they wanted to, right? And I'll meet with them during office hours and talk about their study techniques. And as we go over their study strategy maybe wasn't geared towards things where they needed to direct their strategy. So maybe they weren't focusing on their weaknesses as much as they needed to. All right. We could also see this in our organizations as well. Okay. Sometimes employees work really hard, but it's not necessarily on a project that you need them to put time and energy into, or they're not prioritizing the right tasks. All of these things that we're discussing here have to do with your direction. The final component to motivation that we have to talk about here is persistence. And this is a measure of how long a person can maintain their effort. Okay. So persistence is really important. I remember when I was managing, I often pushed my people pretty hard. All right. And one of my regrets when I look back is that sometimes I pushed them at a level of intensity that was so high that there was no way that they could have long term persistence at that level of intensity. Okay. So people could maybe work really hard for a week straight, but at some point they couldn't work late every night. They had to kind of trail off. And how long they would be able to put this intense effort in for was reflective of their persistence. So now that we've established what motivation is, let's look at some theories of motivation. The first one we'll discuss today is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Okay, and Maslow's hierarchy basically said that we have different levels of needs. Okay, and you see those different levels kind of marked out here on the pyramid, right? And basically, what Maslow said was you have to meet the needs of one level before you move on trying to satisfy the needs of another. All right. So at the very base of Maslow's pyramid, we have physiological needs. All right. And what physiological needs refer to is they refer to your physical needs. So this could be things like hunger, thirst, shelter, basically things that we need to survive physically. All right. Then after that, Maslow said we had needs pertaining to safety and security. All right. And these needs here, they would be exactly what we would think of. They'd be like protection from physical and emotional harm. All right. Then once we've met that, we would try to meet our needs for social belongingness, okay, or interpersonal relationships with others, friendship, things of that nature. Then we move on to esteem, okay, and esteem deals with things like achievement and things of that nature, okay, self respect, autonomy, basically all the different things that make us feel better about ourselves. All right. And then finally, at the top of Maslow's hierarchy, we have self-actualization. And this really deals with trying to meet our greater potential, okay, to be what it is that we could become. Now, if you're trying to walk through the intuition behind Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what you could say is you could say, as we identify meeting a lower level need before we can meet a higher level need, think about your physiological needs. Okay, so we talk about food, shelter, things of that nature. All right. If people consider their work to be something that supports their physiological needs, right? So they might not be able to afford to lose hours or to lose their job if they're going to meet their physiological needs. All right. And because of that, what we could run into is a situation where people are willing to work late and maybe miss going to their bowling league or miss going to a social event because this social belongingness component is not something that they're worried about or focused on until their physiological needs are met. Now, as we talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's very important to recognize what we know about Maslow's, why we cover it, and what you need to know. So, the first thing I'm going to tell you is that there's not an awful lot of support out there in the research for Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's very intuitive as we think of Maslow's hierarchy. It makes a lot of sense, so people like it, but there's not a lot of support for it out there. So, why do we teach it if there's not a lot of support? Well, the answer to that is pretty simple. Okay, a lot of people still talk about Maslow's hierarchy, and leaders talk about Maslow's hierarchy, and people in organizations talk about Maslow's hierarchy. So if you go through a class on organizational behavior or you take a lesson on motivation and it doesn't mention Maslow's hierarchy at all, you're not going to be very well prepared for those conversations. All right, so the key takeaway that you do need to recognize here once you understand the basic structure of Maslow's hierarchy is that even though there is a lot of intuitive logic behind the model that we just looked at, there's not a lot of validation for it, and it hasn't really been researched in over half a century. Next, we're going to talk about Herzberg's two factor theory or the motivation hygiene theory. Okay, and what this dealt with is this dealt with how we look at satisfaction and dissatisfaction in the workplace. So, if we start and we think about the traditional viewpoint of satisfaction and dissatisfaction, we would think of satisfaction as being at one end of the spectrum, and we would think of dissatisfaction as being at the other end of the spectrum. Now, Herzberg came along and said, wait a minute, that's not necessarily the case. Okay. There might be things that motivate people in organizations, and those motivating factors might lead to satisfaction. Okay. But the absence of those motivating factors might not be dissatisfaction. It might just be the absence of satisfaction. So there's no satisfaction. All right. Then Herzberg said we have hygiene factors. And these are the things that people expect to have within the organization. These are kind of like our basics that we expect to be there no matter what. Now, Herzberg said if those things aren't there, then we should have dissatisfaction because when we violate people's expectations, they're going to be dissatisfied. But he said those things being there are not going to satisfy people, they're just going to keep them from being dissatisfied. Now, what's the difference between a satisfier and a dissatisfier, or a motivator and a hygiene factor? You might be wondering. So, over here on this side, we have things that Herzberg would say would lead to extreme satisfaction. And those things are achievement, we have recognition, we have the work itself, responsibility, advancement, and growth. All right, then over here on the other side, we have things that could lead to dissatisfaction or hygiene factors. Okay, and those are policy and administration, supervision, relationships with supervisors, work conditions, salary, believe it or not. Money falls over here on the hygiene factors, okay, and relationships with peers. Now, like Maslow's hierarchy, Hertzberg's theory has been pretty influential, but does have some opportunity for more support in research. There is limited support for Hertzberg's theory in the research. All right. And one of the questions with it deals really with the reliability of the methodology, particularly because it relies on self reports. Okay. And the challenge is that Hertzberg's theory has historically been looked at by having people look back on their experiences and think about times that they were satisfied and dissatisfied. And there can be some bias involved in those types of reflections. Often, when we look back on our past, we can think of times that were really great times when we reflect on them, but in the moment, maybe we didn't feel as great about them as we do when we're reflecting. So that's a little bit of the challenge here dealing with Hertzberg's two factor theory. Now, another theory that's been pretty influential is McClellan's theory of needs. Okay. And this theory focuses on three different needs. The first being the need for achievement. Okay. Need for achievement deals with our drive to excel, to succeed, to achieve high standards in relationship to others. All right. And for the image here, I used a little bit of a skee ball area. And you'll notice that I pointed to the 50-point circle. I did not point to the 100-point circles. Okay. The reason I pointed to the 50 pointer here is pretty simple. People who are high on a need for achievement, they want to hit a high standard. And this 50 pointer it falls into the high standard, right? Because the minimum that you can get is 10 or 20. Then you can get 30 or 40. 50 is a little bit harder, right? And if you miss the 50, your ball comes down here and it could go down into a 10 slot. All right. But 50 is not all that bad because you can hit a straight shot, the same type of shot you'd use to hit a 30 or a 40. You can hit a straight shot and get right up into the 50. And if you miss it, you might end up landing here. So you're not going to be in such a terrible shot if you shoot the 50. All right. I didn't point to the 100 because the 100 requires a high angle shot. Okay. And if you miss it, you're only going to get 10. There's no chance of getting a rebound where you're going to get a few more points. So this is a much lower percentage shot over here. And it also has no rebound possibility. Whereas this is a higher percentage shot and it's got better rebound possibilities. So how does that relate to McClellan's need for achievement? Well, high achievers, according to McClellan, they want to beat the standard, but they also want to have a pretty good chance at success. So someone shooting over here might be more of a gambler, whereas somebody shooting for this tough shot that is doable and has good rebound potential, that's more of a high achiever. The next need, according to McClellan, is what we call a need for power. All right. And a need for power is a little bit different from a need for status. The need for power really deals with having to make other people behave in a way that they might not have behaved otherwise. Okay. So you don't just need people to succeed, but you need people to succeed in doing things the way you want them done. And this might sound like a bad thing when you think about it, but there's probably some positions where a high need for power is really helpful. So consider, for instance, a position where safety standards are terribly important, right? And maybe people don't naturally follow the safety standards, but failure to follow them could lead to a serious injury. Okay, in that type of case, a need for power could actually be helpful in leadership because getting people to behave in exactly the way they need to behave would be critical to success in that environment. McClellan's final need is the need for affiliation, and this is just the need for a desire to have friendly and close interpersonal relationships with other people. Although there has been some good support and research for McClellan's theory, There are some challenges using it in practice. And one of those challenges is that because the needs are subconscious, or at least theorized as being subconscious, it may be difficult to measure them. Okay, so someone may have a high need for power, but may not consciously be aware of it. So we might not be able to measure that accurately in practice. Okay, there's also a little bit of limitation to the practical effect here because sometimes we don't use these needs or knowledge of these needs to actually motivate people, but they get used to label people based on observations. And there's not a whole lot of practical value to using this knowledge to label people as opposed to using the knowledge to actually motivate them and impact their performance. Now, as we move forward in this video, I want you to pause and think for a moment. Why are you here today? Why are you watching this video? Well, hopefully you're watching the video because you want to be. And the reason I say that is that according to self determination theory, people prefer to feel like they have control over their own actions. So if you're watching this video because it's something that you want to do, then that should put you in a more positive state and better prepare you for learning. Okay. Building on self determination theory, we have something called cognitive evaluation theory. And this theory basically says that there are times when people are paid for work, and as soon as they get paid to do work, it feels less like something they want to do and more like something they have to do. All right. So I'll give you an example. I used to work with an economic development engine. And this economic development engine, it had employees who worked in there as consultants, but it also had a lot of volunteers. And every now and then a volunteer would get hired to become an employee. And one of the things that you often saw over time was that when volunteers became employees, they actually lost some of the passion for the work that they were doing because now that they were working and getting paid and had bosses, the work wasn't as intrinsically valuable to them as it had been when it was volunteer work. Now, as much as we just said that paying people for work might actually decrease their motivation or make the work less rewarding for them, extrinsic rewards can be a little bit complicated. Okay, so for one thing, when we use extrinsic rewards for payoffs, sometimes they can be used as a signal that tell employees that they're doing a good job, right? So if you're a salesperson, you get a sales bonus. That sales bonus is communicating a message to you that you did a good job. All right. And self determination theory acknowledges that these rewards can improve your intrinsic motivation under some circumstances. So, for example, perhaps if that bonus signals to you that you're doing a good job, sending you that signal might also help in terms of your intrinsic motivation. Okay. Now, eliminating extrinsic rewards can also shift your perception as to why you work on a task from an external to an internal explanation. But that's a little bit of a complex dynamic because there's obviously going to be repercussions to eliminating extrinsic rewards that people have come to rely on and expect. Now, self concordance tells us that how strongly people's reasons for pursuing goals are consistent with their values impacts their motivation, impacts their satisfaction. So, for example, I value research. I believe that doing research and doing high quality research informs my teaching. So, doing good research informs my teaching. It makes me a better teacher. Being a good teacher also informs me of research ideas. There's a synergy there. That's part of my core values as an educator. All right. So when my goals at work include doing high quality research, all right, then I tend to find myself in a situation where I'm more satisfied with my job. But when my goals don't incorporate doing high quality research, they don't incorporate that value, then I'm more likely to find myself in a situation where I'm not quite as satisfied. And that's building off this idea of self-concordance. So what does all this mean in a practical sense? So for individuals, for you maybe as students going out and thinking about getting your first career oriented job, make sure you try to choose jobs for reasons other than extrinsic rewards. Choose jobs that, in addition to providing you the salary and benefits that you need, also are going to provide you the opportunity to meet some of your intrinsic goals. All right. And for organizations, you also want to find ways to provide intrinsic incentives. Now, as an organization, can you really provide an intrinsic incentive? That might be kind of tough, right? Because they're intrinsic. But what you can do is you can provide a structure that allows people to meet their intrinsic needs. So the example that I'll give you here is Google years ago used to have like 20% flex time or 20% creative time is really I think what they called it. And basically they told employees 20% of your week should be dedicated towards something that you care about doing. Okay? And we're not going to tell you what to do with that time. And they got many great projects out of that. Google Voice was a project that came out of that. And so it was actually a highly successful program for them from a creativity standpoint, but it also allowed employees to pursue some of their interest and provided some intrinsic incentives. Next, we're going to move on to goal setting theory here. And goal setting theory tells us that telling an employee what needs to be done and how much effort they need should help motivate them. So, specific goals will increase performance if they know exactly what it is they need to do. If the goals are difficult and the employees buy into them, that should result in higher performance than if we provide easy goals. And feedback is also going to lead to higher performance than not providing feedback. Some other factors that can influence the goals performance relationship are goal commitment. So people will achieve if they believe that they can achieve. Okay. They also have to want to achieve. All right. So if people don't believe that they can do something, they don't want to do it, then their goal commitment is going to be lower. All right. Task characteristics also help with the goal performance relationship. So if tasks are simple and they're independent, so you're not reliant on someone else or you're not reliant upon the success of another task, then those types of task characteristics are going to be more conducive to high performance. And culture can also influence the goal performance relationship. And different people are motivated by goals differently. All right. So people with a promotion focus, they're looking for advancement, accomplishment, and they're going to look towards situations that are going to drive them closer to their desired goals. Okay. So they might be more likely to do things that are going to result in high task performance. They might be more likely to be innovative or engage in organizational citizenship behavior. But the key point here is that people with a promotion focus are going to be a little less risk averse and they're going to strive to succeed. Now, people with a prevention focus, they're going to kind of resemble being risk averse a little more. All right, and what they're going to try to do is they're going to try to do everything that they need to do to meet their obligations, but they want to avoid conditions that pull them away from desired goals. So it's what we call kind of a safety performance. All right, they're basically going to look to just put themselves in a situation where they can do what they need to do, but not take much risk as they move forward. Now, as we think about setting goals that are going to be effective, okay, we've got a list of characteristics over here on the top that we're going to look at. And I want you to think of them in terms of setting what we call SMART goals. And I want to use this acronym because you're going to see this acronym or hear this acronym a lot when you're in industry. Okay, so the first component that we talk about here is goal specificity. All right, and that's obviously the same as the specific component to a SMART goal. All right, then I'm going to skip participation for a second. We have explicit time period. Okay, and that's obviously related to this time based component. All right, then we have performance feedback over here. And performance feedback really is related to this idea of having goals that are measurable. Okay, and then the last piece we had that we haven't discussed is participation in decision making. And this one here is really, I believe, related to the A and the R in SMART. Because if you look at this and you connect it to being attainable and to being relevant, having participation, having employee participation in setting goals helps to ensure that those goals are attainable and relevant. And early on in this course, we talked a little bit about the OB model and thinking about the relationship between the macro or the organizational level outcomes and the micro or the individual level outcomes. Okay. And this same idea applies to goal setting. All right. So we start with thinking about what are our goals for the entire organization. All right. Once we identify those goals, we look at what do different divisions need to do in order for the organizational goal to be achieved. Okay. Then, when we think about the divisions, we break it down to what do our different departments need to do within the divisions for the divisions to meet their goals. And then, as we look within the departments, we come down to what do the individuals need to do down here. All right. And you can have more than a few levels to your organization and work down through the same set of cascading objectives. But the point is, we start with our large organizational goals, and then we break them down by unit until we get to the goals that have to be set for individuals. And one of the challenges with goal setting though is that we also have to make sure that our goals don't put our employees in a situation where goals are in conflict with ethics. All right, because if that happens, that can be a little bit problematic. And one example that I'm gonna dive into a little bit when we talk about the Pygmalion effect in a few slides is when I was in industry, we had some pretty high sales goals from month to month, and the rewards for hitting the goals were great. All right, the penalties for missing them for upper management were a little bit of a challenge to deal with, and there were certainly some times that there was some pressure put on us as managers to to create some ethical violations in order to make sure we hit our goals. Like I said, when we get into the Pygmalion effect, I'm going to break that down in a little more detail. The next theory that we're going to break down in terms of motivation is self efficacy theory. All right, and this deals with an individual's belief that they're capable of performing a task. And there are four components that we look at in self efficacy theory to discuss how do we improve people's self efficacy. Because the higher someone's self efficacy is, the higher their belief is that they're capable of performing a task. And this is related to what we just talked about with goals, right? The higher their efficacy is, the more successful they're going to be. All right. So we start with an active mastery. And an active mastery basically means that people have to practice tasks. Okay. The more you do a task, the more you're going to believe that you can do it. All right. And that's probably the most important component to self-efficacy. The second component is vicarious modeling. So if someone shows you how to do something, you're more likely to believe that you can do it. Okay? If you've ever been to a carnival, you see people who work at the stands, they'll come out and they'll show you that they can win a game before they ask you if you want to try to play. And their point is they're trying to build up your belief that you can do it. Now, in that case, it's a little bit different because they're hoping you're going to lose at the end of the day, but they're trying to increase your motivation so that by increasing your self efficacy, so that you will pay money and play the game. All right. The third component to improving our self efficacy is verbal persuasion. And this is just people telling you that you have the ability to complete a task, to be successful. All right. So very often when I send emails to students, I'll try to make sure I have a message in there. You're going to be okay, or you could do this, or just something of that nature, right? And that's me trying to have some verbal persuasion in there to increase their self efficacy and help motivate them and help them perform at a higher level. And the fourth component is arousal. Okay, and this is really just getting psyched up. So if you've played sports, we have different things that we do. We might do a cheer at the end of practice. We might do some activities to psych each other up. Okay. But sometimes people do this in organizations too. When I worked at Home Depot, they actually had a cheer that they did at Home Depot. It was a little bit cheesy, but it did get people excited sometimes. Okay. Those are the four components that are the most important to improving people's self-efficacy. Now, to make sure you really have a good feel for what self-efficacy is, we'll take a look at some of the types of questions we use in a scale to measure it. So the first one is, if I can't do a job the first time, I keep trying until I can. All right. The second one is, if something looks too complicated, I will not even bother to try it. And the third one is, I feel insecure about my ability to do things. Now, obviously, these last two here are reverse scored. So if you were high on those two questions, that would indicate you were low on self-efficacy, whereas the first one is scored normally. So if you were high on this one, that would indicate that you were high on self-efficacy. Now, if we look at the model over here, the model basically says a manager sets a difficult specific goal or task, and the individual has confidence that their level of performance will be attained. Okay, so they have self-efficacy, and that ultimately should lead to the individual having higher job or task performance. The challenge as a manager here is, as you set the difficult task, you need to make sure that it's challenging enough that it's going to be motivating, but not too difficult. Because if you set a task that's going to be too difficult, then we're gonna have a situation here where self-efficacy will not be high. Okay, if the task is too difficult, self-efficacy won't be high, and then that's going to have a negative impact on the job performance or the task performance. Now, the implications of self-efficacy theory, essentially what we're figuring is going to happen here is we're going to have something called the Pygmalion effect, or a self-fulfilling prophecy, where essentially you believe you could do something, you envision yourself doing it, and because you believe it and envision it, you're able to make it happen. All right, so I told you I was going to bring up ethical issues when we talked about the Pygmalion effect. So here's what I got for you. One of the companies I used to work at, we had monthly sales targets, and these monthly sales targets, they were important. We got we got bonuses if we hit them. All right, for higher ranked people, it was a little bit problematic if you missed. All right, and I had taken over a failing location and I had turned it profitable. I had hit something like 18 monthly sales quotas in a row. If you went back to my previous position, I had something like, I'd only missed two out of my last 24, or two out of my last 30, something like that. It was pretty much expected I was going to hit my quota. All right. So Monday morning call, week left in the month of January. My boss says to me, "All right, you're good. You're going to hit, right?" I said, "No, we're going to miss this month. Weather was terrible. It was things were not going in our favor." I said, "No, we're going to miss." And he said, "You can't miss. You always hit." And I said, "Well, we're going to miss this month. Um, we don't have the numbers to make it work." And he says, "You're going to hit. We'll make sure of it." And he hangs up. And about a half an hour later, I get a call from someone in another location. They're telling me they want me to bill some orders for them and that I'll have to pay them back later on. And this is something, basically what they want to do is they want to manipulate sales. They were going to give me some sales this month. I'd have to give them some sales a different month, and everyone would hit their quotas and move on. But this was actually against my company's code of ethics. All right, so that's an example of where goals were inspiring people to violate ethics. Okay. And I said, "No, I'm not going to do that." And they said, "Well, you better call the boss and tell him." So I called my district manager and I said, "I'm not going to do that. It's a violation of our code of ethics." And he basically said, "What's that? What's that?" Um, Acted as if it didn't exist. And I said, "No, I don't break the rules like that. That's not what I'm going to do. If I'm going to miss, I'm going to miss." And he called me some choice words. There were some very inappropriate statements made, and ultimately he hung up and said, "Well, you better find a way to hit your quota." So I called my team into my office and I said, "Look, this is what just happened." I said, "You all know that I stand behind my ethics." I said, "I'm not about to do what they asked me to do." I said, "So I want to make sure that you're aware of it, because I want to make sure nobody tries to work around me." And my top salesperson, he looks at me and he says, "I don't like you very much." He used to like to come in late a lot, and I didn't let him come in late. So he says, "I don't like you very much." He goes, "But I really hate your boss." He's like, "We're gonna find a way to hit this quota." And he got the entire team inspired. He got them, you know, aroused, so to speak. He got them pumped up about the idea that that we are location 0629 and we do things the ethical way, and we're going to show them that we don't need to break their rules. And my team went out there and they put together a sales plan that I don't know how they pulled this off given what the context was, but we actually hit our sales quota that month. And to this day I say this was an example of Pygmalion effect, because my crew came together and they said, we have to do this because we have to demonstrate that doing what's right works, and we're going to do it. And there was no doubt in their mind that they were going to be able to do it, and they just went out, they dreamed it happening, and they made it happen. Now, the next theory that we're going to talk about here is B.F. Skinner's reinforcement theory. And you might hear this talked about in the context of behaviorism. What Skinner did was Skinner worked more in a space that we tend to think of as biology, but he looked at animals and how we reinforce animals' behavior and how reinforcement changes the way they behave in the future. And this is a picture of Skinner as he's about to teach a pigeon to turn in a 360-degree circle. And what he does is every time the pigeon turns left, he gives it a little bit of a treat. Each time it turns left a little bit more, he gives it more of a treat until it does a complete circle. All right. And some people will argue that reinforcement theory really only applies in biological context, but it does apply to humans. And I think one of the best illustrations for me of this was shortly after having the argument with a colleague about whether or not Skinner's theory applied to people. I had gone out for a run. I was running towards a crosswalk. The crosswalk sign went from the white cross sign to a countdown saying there was only 20 seconds left or something like that. As soon as I saw the countdown, I didn't even think. I just sprinted across the crosswalk. Got to the other side and realized, oh yeah, I don't need to be here. What I had was I had a reaction to the crosswalk sign changing because of how it's reinforced. If you don't get across in time, you don't get to cross the street. So that's an example where that comes in. But how does this come in our organizations? Well, the example I like to use in organizations for my students is think about a student coming in late to class. They come in 10 minutes late, and you say every time they come in, "Oh, thanks for joining us today. Nice to see you today." You say something that embarrasses them, right? They come in late three times, you embarrass them three times. Well, what's going to happen the next time they're about to come in late? They're going to make the decision, most likely, not to come in at all because they don't want to go through that embarrassment. And what we've done there is through our reinforcement, trained them not to come in late and instead not to come in at all. So we have to be very careful how we reinforce things within our organizations. So Skinner's reinforcement theory basically says that behavior is a function of consequences, and this might appear to be in conflict with goal setting theory, which says goal setting is a cognitive approach as an individual's purpose directs his or her action, but the two can kind of work in conjunction in some sense. All right. And the sense would be that as people work towards a goal, the way that consequences impact them are going to reinforce and change their behavior as to how they achieve the goal. All right. So there can be some complementary nature between reinforcement theory and goal setting, even though they may look at first like they are in conflict with each other. The next theory we're going to discuss here is social learning theory. And social learning theory basically says that we can learn through observation and direct experience. Okay, so there are four different processes that are critical to social learning theory. The first one is attentional processes. So a model only works when we recognize it and pay attention to critical features. So if we're zoned out, if we're not paying attention, we're not going to learn, we're not going to be motivated. Process two is retention processes. All right. So the influence of a model depends on how well you remember it once it is gone. Process three is motor reproduction processes. All right. So something must be converted to doing. Watching must be converted to doing for the demonstration to be effective. So a demonstration on its own is not going to be effective unless you actually try the task yourself. And finally, reinforcement processes. So positively reinforced behaviors are learned better and perform more often. So if we notice our employees doing something that we want them to do and we thank them for doing that frequently, they're more likely to do it again in the future. Now, Room's expectancy theory says there's three different relationships that we have to consider along the path from an employee's individual effort to their personal goals. All right. And that understanding these relationships is going to understand how we motivate people. So the first relationship is an individual effort to individual performance. All right. So what do we mean by individual effort to individual performance? If we ask our people to make sales calls, all right, if they make sales calls, is that going to result in them making more sales? All right. If making sales calls results in making more sales, then this relationship, number one here, the effort performance relationship, is going to be strong, and that should be motivating. All right. The next relationship is individual performance to organizational rewards. All right. If our employees make more sales, are they going to get a bonus? All right. If making more sales leads to a bonus, then that means that we have a stronger performance reward relationship. So if we have a stronger performance reward relationship, that also should support motivation according to expectancy theory. All right. And then the final component is organizational rewards to personal goals. All right. Is that bonus related to our employees' goals? If the employee's goal is to make money, then we have a strong relationship here between rewards and personal goal relationship. Okay. If, however, the employee's personal goals are something else, maybe they want to get promoted, maybe they don't care that much about earning a bonus right now, but they want to climb the ladder. Okay. In that case, this relationship might be weaker, and we might not be in a situation where the program that we've put in place is going to be highly motivating for that person. To summarize what we just talked about with Room's expectancy theory, basically expectancy theory says people are going to act in a certain way depending on the expectation that the response to their action is going to be an outcome that's attractive to them. Now, if we take expectancy theory and we apply it here to think about what are questions that will be asked, that expectancy theory helps to contextualize in terms of understanding people's performance. Um, if I give maximum effort, will it be recognized in my performance appraisal? If I get a good performance appraisal, will it lead to rewards? And if I'm rewarded, are the rewards attractive to me? And if the answer to all three of those questions is yes, then employees should be motivated. Another important component to motivation is perceptions of organizational justice. All right, and perceptions of justice basically deal with the relationship between an employee's rewards and the employee's input, or the employee's outcomes and the employee's input. And what we do is we look at outcomes to input for ourselves and we compare those to outcomes for input for others. All right. And if we find ourselves in a situation where our outcomes than are lower than someone else's outcomes, but our inputs are the same, so the ratio is lower for us than it is for someone else, then we perceive inequity due to being under rewarded. If we find ourselves in a situation where the relationship between outcomes and input is similar for us and other parties, then we find ourselves in a situation where we perceive there to be equity. And there's always the possibility that we can perceive our outcome to input relationship to be higher than that of someone else's. And if that's the case, there's inequity due to being over rewarded. And equity can be complex because there's internal equity and there's external equity. Okay. And with internal equity, the reference point is within the organization. So we're looking at people within our own company as we compare here. Then we have external equity, and with external equity, the referent point can be outside the organization. So to illustrate this, I ask you to consider college professors in two different colleges. So we have college A and we have college B. All right. And we have two different types of college professors here. We have one group that's in humanities and one group that is in business. Okay. And over here in college A, the humanities professor and the business professor maybe don't have equity in terms of pay, maybe they don't have equity in terms of workload, but there's some type of inequity here. Okay, where one professor is paid or compensated at a different level than another professor. All right, but if we look at the business professor in college A and we compare them to the business professor in college B, they're compensated fairly similarly. So we have external equity over here, but what we do not have here is internal equity. Okay. Now we take a look up at the top of the model and we look at the humanities professor at college A and the humanities professor at college B, and maybe they're compensated similarly. They have similar workloads. So there's external equity there. All right. Now, this gets even more challenging because maybe we compare them in industry and we see you know, what we have that compares in industry, and maybe the people who are in industry get paid more in both humanities and business. Okay. And in that case, industry maybe is driving some of the pay structure over here just a little bit. Okay. So we've got this internal inequity that we've identified here. All right. Between the humanities professor and the business professor, and put you in a little bit of a quandary, right? Because obviously we want to resolve the internal inequity issue. But the problem is, how do we resolve the internal inequity issue without creating an inequity issue from the external standpoint? Okay. So if we take and we decrease the pay or increase the workload of the professor who is viewed as having a higher outcome to input ratio, then what we're going to do is we're going to create an external inequity. All right. And we have to address how is that going to work? Because if we create external inequity, one of the risks that we run is we create the risk that our employees will leave. So, is there a right answer to this? This is a very complex issue, but it's important that we recognize the difference between internal and external equity, because if we don't recognize the difference between them and how they complement each other and the complexity of this issue, we run the risk of making very simple decisions about very complex problems and potentially running into circumstances that are very different from what we anticipated. So, what kind of circumstances can we run into when we have issues of equity? Well, when people believe there's inequity, they might change their inputs. Okay, what that means is that they might do things like try a little less hard. They might put a little less time into their work. Okay, they might change their outcomes. All right, this hopefully is not going to happen because this is a pretty negative thing. But in some cases, we find employees who steal to kind of compensate for what they believe is being is under compensation. All right. Sometimes we distort our perceptions of ourselves. Okay. So maybe if I'm being undercompensated and I'm really bothered by this, maybe I start to perceive myself as being a lower quality worker, and that helps justify this for me. Sometimes we distort our perceptions of others. Maybe we just look at other people and see them as being that much better. All right. Maybe we choose a different referent. So if the issue is similar to what we looked at before, maybe instead of comparing ourselves to others within our own organization, we compare ourselves to others who do similar work to us in other organizations. And then the other option, the final option, is you can leave. You can leave the field, you could leave your company, you could leave your job, okay? But you leave. You look to go somewhere else where you can find a more equitable situation. Now, related to equity, we have something called organizational justice, which is our overall perception of what's fair in the workplace. Okay, and there are three different components to justice, to organizational justice. The first is distributive justice. Okay. And this is the perceived fairness of the outcome. So this really relates to what we looked at before. All right. Does what I receive at the end of the day match up with what other people receive fairly? All right. The second piece is procedural justice. All right. And with procedural justice, what we're looking at is the process that was used to determine outcomes. Okay. So did I go through the same evaluation process as my peers? Was I evaluated fairly in this process? Okay. And then the third component is interactional justice. And this is just, was I treated with dignity? Was I treated well? All right. So if my manager told me I wasn't getting a raise, did he explain it to me in a nice way that reflected my dignity as a human being? Or did he sit down and have a bunch of nasty things to say to me in explaining this? And justice is important in terms of motivation because when employees perceive that there is organizational justice, they tend to have both higher levels of task performance and higher levels of organizational citizenship behavior. Now, we're going to touch on job engagement real quick because this was really discussed in more detail in one of our earlier units. Job engagement is the investment of an employee's physical, cognitive, and emotional energies into job performance. So, what are people putting into the work that they're doing? A recent poll done by the Gallup organization showed that more engaged employees are in successful organizations than in average organizations. So, people who are investing more into their work are contributing to more successful organizations than people who aren't investing in their work. So when we try harder, we do better. Seems pretty fairly intuitive here. Now that we've established that engagement is going to be related to performance, we want to think about what makes people more engaged in their job. All right. So if an employee believes it's meaningful to engage in their work, they're going to be engaged. If there's a good match between an individual's values and the organization's values, there's going to be higher levels of engagement and leadership behaviors that inspire workers to do greater work is going to lead to greater engagement. We've all worked for leaders who really inspire us in the past, and we've all worked for leaders who haven't really inspired us. And when we're with people who inspire us, we just tend to be more engaged with what we're doing. So are highly engaged employees getting too much of a good thing is the question. Well, first things first, the construct does overlap a little bit with some other job attitudes. So we need to make sure we recognize that. But there is also a potential dark side to job engagement. And the dark side is that positive relationships between job engagement and work family conflict. And what we mean by that is that for some people, as job engagement increases, so does their work family conflict. All right, so it creates a little bit of a problem for them. And just a little side note here, that is totally me. So, in addition to having research that supports this that we could speak to, I can give you anecdotal evidence on this one in my own life as well. And with that, we've wrapped up our unit here on motivation. Hope you learned something. Hope you enjoyed it. And we'll see you soon.